Every so often, Sony drops a new camera on us with slightly improved specifications, but that doesn't mean that we all automatically go out and buy it. Today, I've got with me the Sony A7R IV. Camera technology doesn't seem like it's advancing as quickly as it was years ago, and the improvements seem to be getting smaller and smaller, diminishing returns, right? And for those of you considering switching, or those of you thinking about picking up a new camera, in this video, I'm going to talk about how the previous version of the camera might actually be the best path forward for you. So let's talk just a little bit about the Sony A7 line leading up to the release of the A7R IV. The Sony A7 series, Sony's foray into full-frame mirrorless cameras, was announced back in 2013. These cameras quickly gained a reputation of pushing the boundaries of mirrorless camera technology. These cameras also represented a line in the sand where Sony stopped developing their Alpha series of SLR cameras. The announcement of the original Sony A7R mirrorless camera took the imaging sensor that Sony had developed themselves, the same one that was parading around in the Nikon D800, and introduced mirrorless shooters to the world of high-resolution imaging. Sony came out with an A7R II, an A7R III in 2017, and that brings us to the A7R IV, which came out in 2019. And the Sony A7R IV had a couple notable features, but the most impressive one was the 61 megapixel sensor, and that was up from the 42.4 megapixel sensor of the previous versions. Other notable improvements to the Sony A7R IV were the the sensor's impressive 15 stops of dynamic range, 567 phase detection autofocus points, and 4K video recording. All of these technological advancements represented a significant increase over the previous version, that A7R III. The A7R IV, upon its announcement, was released to widespread acclaim. Photographers everywhere loved the camera, reviews sung the praises of the camera to kind of the perfect combination between an exceptional photography camera, also with very good video capabilities. And with this video, the main camera that I'm going to compare the R4 to is obviously the R5. I've already made a video in the past about the value proposition that the A7R III represents, and if you're on a little bit more of a budget, those cameras can be had for next to nothing. But I'm assuming that you've already accepted that you want that 61 megapixel goodness that comes along with the R4 or the R5. So let's talk a little bit more about the specifications of the Sony A7R IV. Like we talked about, it's got that 61 megapixel imaging sensor, and it's got the Sony Bionz X imaging processor. The camera has a standard ISO range of 100 to 32,000, but that can be expanded from 50 to 102,000. I don't really spend a lot of time effing with those expanded ISO ranges, but maybe that's something you're into, weird grainy images. When mirrorless cameras first burst onto the scene, they couldn't match SLRs for autofocus speed and autofocus accuracy early on. And something that Sony has done a really good job improving with each iteration of the A7R is the autofocus speed and accuracy. And on this camera, it's no different. With the 567 phase detection points and 425 contrast detection points, a significant step forward from the A7R III. And something that made this camera even better was it featured real-time eye tracking AF for both people and animals. The camera features really fast, continuous shooting of up to 10 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. And like many of the previous versions of the camera as well, the camera also features a silent shooting mode, which is really great for wedding photography. Continuing the improvements brought from the A7R II and III, the camera also features in-body image stabilization, which does a really good job providing enhanced stability for those low-light shots. And something that you're already familiar with if you've handled one of these Sony A7R cameras before is it features really nice build quality. Comparing this to my Sony A7R III, the camera does feel like it's built a little nicer, although that may be an illusion just because of the weight. But one thing that isn't an illusion is how deep the grip is on the R4. I've got pretty big hands, and the Sony A7R IV feels much nicer than the tiny grip on the A7R III, which was already an improvement on the R2. If you've got pretty big hands, the A7R IV is going to feel much nicer than the III. So those are a lot of the main specifications for the Sony A7R IV. And I'm not going to make this a comprehensive review. There are tons of videos out there that do a great job going over all that. Mainly what we're going to focus on though now is comparing it to the Sony A7R V so we can figure out just how good of a deal this thing may be. So I think the first and most obvious point of comparison in a video like this is talking about the price. And these cameras, the Sony A7R IV, can be had on eBay for about $1,500 to $1,700. And you compare that to the price of a Sony A7R V. Now, admittedly, these came out not even a year ago at this point. You can still buy them new for about $4,000. So you're getting a significant discount by going with the Sony A7R IV. The discount's going to be $2,000 or more at this point. So this video isn't going to be about which camera is better, because I will happily concede that the Sony A7R V is going to be a better camera in a lot of meaningful categories. But does it represent a good value? That's what we're going to talk about. So we talked a little bit about ergonomics and size and weight, and the Sony A7R V is very similar to the Sony A7R IV, albeit just a little chunkier. One thing that they've done on the R5 is the LCD on the back is now a 3.2-inch screen. This one's just a 3-inch screen. And something else that they've done, and this is really nice on the Sony A7R IV, is instead of having a tilt screen, it has a dual tilt screen. So not only will it go to the back, but it'll also flip out to the side. So the Sony A7R V does have a much nicer screen on the back. It's going to be larger, and you're going to be able to move it in more directions. A couple of other really convenient things about the R5 versus the R4. The R5 is going to have a much nicer screen. It's going to have more pixels, and that goes for the EVF as well. The EVF on the R5 is almost 10 million dots, where this one is nearly 5 million dots. So you're going to get a much nicer EVF too. And there are a couple of those obvious improvements that are going to come along with the R5. Although these aren't revolutionary, they're kind of what we expect iteration to iteration from Sony. Better autofocus and better in-body image stabilization. The new Sony A7R V is just better in both categories. But I would argue, perhaps not meaningfully so, the Sony A7R series of cameras have been really good with respect to autofocus and in-body image stabilization for a long time. Diminishing returns. This is mature technology at this point. Every year that passes, we're getting smaller and smaller incremental upgrades. The biggest game-changing feature that came along with the Sony A7R V, at least in my mind, was the addition of the ability to shoot 8K video. The Sony A7R IV, it's stuck at 4K 30, but the new Sony A7R V is going to do 8K 24 frames per second. Ultimately, the video specifications that come along with the A7R V are the most tempting things for me. As someone who spends a lot of time making videos, it's what we're doing right now. That is something that's interesting and would be useful for me. So that's the thing that tempts me the most, and to me, that's the biggest distinction between the two cameras. They have the same sensor. The A7R V has marginally better autofocus, marginally better IBIS, and then convenient things like the LCDs, but the video specifications that come along with the A7R V are just way, way, way better. So if you're a quality snob and you want the best possible video specifications on your camera, that will help make your decision. The Sony A7R V might provide a lot more value for you long term. So to me, that's really the big question that you need to ask yourself. Are those features that the Sony A7R V has over the Sony A7R IV, are they worth an additional $2,000? For most people and for most use cases, I just can't really see that being justified. So here I am again screaming into the void. So here I am again, screaming into the void, trying to influence you guys into making better financial decisions. If money is no object to you, this is kind of a no-brainer, and I don't know why you're watching this video. Go ahead and buy the Sony A7R V. But if you're like me, and a couple of $1,000 actually means something, this is one of those decisions that it does pay to be a little more fiscally conscious, right? $2,000, $2,500, that's a lot of money to do something else with. Or that's a really nice trip to Iceland, or a really nice trip to somewhere in Europe. You can buy the slightly inferior camera, and when I say slightly, a camera that's going to be 97, 96% as good as the Sony A7R V, and you're going to be able to keep the extra cash and do something really cool with it. So that would be my advice to you guys. I mean, think about it like this. I'm not an old guy by any stretch of the imagination, but I was around and very interested in photography when the Nikon D800 was announced. And I'm sorry to say that imaging technology really hasn't advanced all that much since the Nikon D800. Before that, we had been on this constant treadmill of improvement, year after year, digital camera technology getting better and better, but it really seems with the D800 and subsequent cameras, things really plateaued, and the image quality hasn't got all that much better. I mean, take a look at some of those DxO mark scores. If you're primarily photography focused, you're gonna get the same darn images, the same high quality imaging out of the Sony A7R IV that you're gonna get out of the Sony A7R V. So just something to bear in mind. If you guys are out there and you're fiending for these new expensive cameras, you know, I've mentioned this a few times in the video, that concept of diminishing returns. You know, this is an economics concept. The more we spend on things past a certain point, the rate of improvement decreases, right? Think about a hammer. A $25 hammer is a pretty darn good hammer. If you were to buy a $500 hammer, how much more benefit can you get? I've got a really nice $25 hammer on my pegboard back there. It's an Eastman. It's really good. You can't spend $500 on a hammer and get a hammer that does much more than that. And relating that back to the main point, we are certainly at that point with digital camera. Back in 2012, when Nikon released the D800, we had really darn good images, and we've had really darn good images from every camera since. So don't think yourself into a pretzel. The Sony A7R IV is magnificent. decent, and unless you're gonna need 8K 24 for something, it's probably better off to just skip it and wait till the prices come down. But if you're interested in saving potentially even more money, check out this video I made about the Sony A7R III. Many of the concepts that I talk about in this video are still true as it relates to that camera as well. It's a really great camera, and most of us are gonna be tickled to death with 42 megapixels. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.